The auction block smelled of stale sawdust, cheap cigar smoke, and desperation. Lot 42 wasn't a horse. She was a jagged silhouette of scarred roan, trembling so violently the metal chute rattled. She pinned her ears flat, baring teeth at anyone foolish enough to meet her wild rolling eyes. "Devil's own mare," muttered the auctioneer, already signaling to drop the starting bid to slaughter prices. Nobody raised a hand. In the back row, Mohammed Fuller adjusted his battered Stetson. He didn't want another broken thing on his struggling ranch, but as the gavel raised, he saw something no one else did: the frantic, intelligent terror of a creature who had simply survived too much. The drive back to the Broken Circle Ranch was a tense, silent affair. Mohammed gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the faded leather. Behind the truck, the rusty stock trailer swayed dangerously every time the mare lunged against the steel sides. She hadn't stopped fighting since they loaded her, a chaotic scramble of hooves, panicked squeals, and the sharp crack of metal. Mohammed sighed, glancing in the rearview mirror. All he saw was the jagged outline of her head, ears pinned flat, nostrils flared. He'd named her Ruin before he'd even handed over the handful of crumpled bills to the auctioneer. It seemed fitting. When they finally rattled over the cattle guard marking the entrance to the Broken Circle, the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the Ruby Mountains, casting long bruised shadows across the valley. Kelly Blazek, the ranch manager, was waiting by the main corral. Her arms were crossed, her posture screaming disapproval. Before Mohammed even shifted into park, "You've lost your mind this time, Mo," Kelly said, her voice sharp enough to cut barbed wire. She watched as the trailer rocked violently. "That isn't a project. That's a liability. We're barely scraping by, and you bring home a killer?" Mohammed didn't argue. He couldn't. He knew the ranch ledgers as intimately as he knew the worn leather of his saddle. But he also remembered the look in the mare's eyes. "She's not a killer, Kelly," Mohammed said quietly, stepping out of the truck. The dust of the road clung to his boots. "She's just terrified. Terrified animals are the ones that put you in the hospital." Kelly shot back, refusing to yield. "Or worse. You remember what happened to Razvan?" Mohammed flinched. The memory of Razvan Vento, a seasoned hand who'd tried to break a wild Mustang 3 years ago and ended up with a shattered pelvis, still haunted the ranch. Razvan hadn't ridden since. "I remember," Mohammed said, his voice tightening. "But I'm not breaking her. I'm just giving her a place to stand." The unloading process was a nightmare. They backed the trailer to the strongest round pen, reinforced with heavy pipe. Mohammed refused to use a whip or a hot prod, relying instead on quiet persistence and the heavy oak-handled lead rope. It took an hour of coaxing, waiting, and avoiding flying hooves before Ruin finally scrambled backward out of the trailer. She hit the dirt of the round pen running. She didn't buck. She bolted, racing around the perimeter like a trapped bird, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The scars on her flanks, old jagged lines from barbed wire, or worse, stood out starkly against her sweat-darkened roan coat. Mohammed stood perfectly still in the center of the pen, letting her run. He didn't raise his hands, didn't speak. He just watched her, analyzing her movement. She favored her left hind leg slightly, and she carried her head too high, a defensive posture born of chronic pain or fear. "Look at her," muttered Simone Darul, the young ranch hand who had joined Kelly by the fence. Simone was barely 20, eager but inexperienced. "She's completely wild." "Not wild," Mohammed corrected softly, his eyes never leaving the horse. "Broken. There's a difference. A wild horse fights to stay free. A broken horse fights because it thinks every touch is going to hurt." As twilight deepened, Ruin's frantic running slowed to a tense, irregular trot, then a stiff walk. She stopped on the far side of the pen, facing the corner, trembling violently. She was exhausted, yet her muscles were coiled springs, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Mohammed slowly took a step forward. Ruin's ears swiveled, and she tensed, preparing to launch herself against the fence again. He stopped instantly. He dropped his eyes, softening his posture, making himself small. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind sighing through the sagebrush. "We have time." He retreated, leaving the pen without ever turning his back on her. When he reached the gate, he saw Louis Cassiano, the local large animal vet, pulling into the yard. Louis climbed out of his truck, his bag in hand, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "Heard you bought a tiger, Mo. Wanted to see if I needed to stitch you up yet." "She's fine, Louis," Mohammed said, though his own heart was hammering. "Just needs a look." Over from a distance, Louis approached the pen cautiously, leaning on the top rail. He observed Ruin in the gathering dark. The mare snorted, stomping a front hoof, warning him back. Malnourished, covered in old scars, likely beaten, definitely mishandled. Louis diagnosed grimly. Her left hock looked slightly swollen, probably an old injury that healed poorly. "Honestly, Mo, she's a write-off." The meat man would have been kinder. The words struck Mohammed like a physical blow. The practical, logical side of him knew Louis was right. But the quiet, stubborn part, the part that had bought the ranch against all advice, refused to listen. "She's staying," Mohammed said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Louis shook his head, packing his bag. "It's your funeral, buddy. Just don't ask me to come out here when she puts you through that fence." That night, Mohammed couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, listening to the silence of the ranch. The only sound was the occasional frantic scramble of hooves from the round pen, a testament to Ruin's restless terror. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he couldn't have let her die in that auction ring. Discarded and terrified. He had to try, even if he didn't know how. For the first week, Mohammed did nothing but sit. He didn't try to touch Ruin, didn't offer a halter, didn't even speak beyond a low hum when he entered the pen. He brought a battered folding chair and simply occupied space near the center of the reinforced enclosure. The first few days, Ruin reacted with explosive panic. The moment he unlatched the gate, she would launch herself at the far panels, snorting and blowing, her eyes wide with unadulterated fear. Mohammed would walk to his chair, sit down and open a book, usually an old manual on soil conservation or rotational grazing. He ignored her completely. It was infuriating for the rest of the ranch staff. Madeleine Bush, the ranch's cook and unofficial matriarch, watched from the kitchen window, shaking her head. "He's wasting daylight." Madeleine grumbled to Kelly over morning coffee. "Sitting out there like a statue while there's fences to mend and cattle to move. That horse isn't learning anything. He says she's learning he's not a threat," Kelly replied, though her tone betrayed her own skepticism. "But at this rate, winter will be here before he gets a halter on her." Mohammed felt the weight of their disapproval, but he held his ground. He understood what they didn't. Ruin had been trained through violence and dominance. Every human interaction she'd ever had ended in pain or force. He had to rewrite that narrative. And the only way to do that was to prove that his presence didn't equal pressure. On the fifth day, a subtle shift occurred. Mohammed was reading, the sun beating down on his neck, when he realized the frantic scrambling had stopped. He didn't look up, keeping his gaze fixed on the page, but he listened intently. He heard the soft swish, swish of a tail, then a long, low exhalation, a sigh. Slowly, carefully, he peeked over the top of his book. Ruin was still on the far side of the pen, but she had stopped pacing. She was standing quietly, her head slightly lowered, watching him. Her ears were pricked forward, not pinned back in anger. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Later that afternoon, Odd Broberg arrived. Odd was a neighbor, a grizzled rancher who ran a massive cattle operation on the adjacent land. He was known for his blunt opinions and traditional methods. Odd leaned over the fence, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard you're running a horse hotel now, Mo." "That the killer?" Mohammed closed his book and stood up slowly. Ruin immediately tensed, throwing her head up, but she didn't bolt. She's not a killer, Odd. Just needs time. Odd snorted. Time is money, son. You can't gentle a horse by reading to it. You gotta get in there, sack her out, show her who's boss. You're teaching her she can ignore you. I'm teaching her I won't hurt her, Mohammed countered quietly. Suit yourself, Odd said, turning away. But when you realize you're in over your head, don't come crying to me to help you load her back into the trailer. She's crazy in the head. You can see it in her eyes. The words stung, partly because they echoed Mohammed's own lingering doubts. Was he wasting his time? Was ruin truly beyond repair? The answer came 2 days later. It was a crisp morning, the air sharp with the scent of pine. Mohammed entered the pen with his chair and a bucket of sweet feed. He placed the bucket a few feet away from the chair, sat down, and waited. For an hour, Ruin ignored the bucket, eyeing Mohammed suspiciously from the far fence. He didn't look at her, focusing entirely on his book. Finally, hunger won out over fear. She took a tentative step forward. Mohammed didn't move. Another step. She stretched her neck out, nostrils flaring, trying to catch his scent. She moved with agonizing slowness, ready to bolt at the slightest twitch. It took her 20 minutes to cross the pen. When she finally reached the bucket, she snatched a mouthful of feed and immediately scrambled backward, chewing frantically while watching him. Mohammed didn't react. He simply turned a page. Over the next hour, she repeated the process, each time retreating a little less. Finally, she stood by the bucket, eating steadily, only a few feet away from where Mohammed sat. He could smell the dust on her coat, the sweet scent of the grain on her breath. Very slowly, he closed the book and rested his hands on his knees. Ruin stopped chewing, her head coming up, ears swiveling toward him. Good girl, he murmured, his voice a soft rumble. She didn't run. She watched him for a long moment, then lowered her head and took another bite. It was the first time she had eaten in his presence, without immediately fleeing. That evening, Mohammed found Sophie Barnes, the ranch's youngest hand, standing by the pen. Sophie was usually quiet, preferring the company of the animals to the ranch hands. She's beautiful, isn't she? Sophie said softly, leaning on the rail. Mohammed joined her, looking at Ruin, who was standing quietly in the center of the pen, bathed in the silver light of the moon. Under all that fear and those scars, yes, Mohammed agreed. I think she understands, Sophie said. She knows you're different. I hope so, Mohammed replied. Because if she doesn't, I don't know what I'll do. The silent treatment was working, but it was slow. And time was a luxury the Broken Circle Ranch was rapidly running out of. The bank was calling, the feed bills were mounting, and Mohammed was spending hours every day sitting in a pen with a horse he couldn't even touch. The pressure was building, a silent storm gathering over the valley. And Mohammed knew that soon he would have to ask Ruin for more than just tolerance. He would have to ask for trust. The transition from presence to touch was the most delicate negotiation Mohammed had ever undertaken. It wasn't about dominance, it was about asking permission, over and over again, until the answer was yes. He started with a long, stiff dressage whip, not to strike, but to extend his reach. He would sit in his chair talking softly, and slowly extend the whip to stroke her shoulder. The first time the tip brushed her coat, Ruin exploded, rearing and striking the air before bolting to the far side of the pen. Mohammed simply lowered the whip and waited. It took 3 days before she allowed the whip to rest on her shoulder, without flinching. You're treating her like she's made of glass, Kelly remarked one afternoon, watching him work. She had brought him a sandwich, a peace offering of sorts, though her skepticism remained. She is, Mohammed said, accepting the food. Her mind is shattered. If I push too hard, I'll break what's left. We need you out in the east pasture, Mo. The fencing there is down, and Carlos is struggling on his own. Carlos Boo was the newest hand, a quiet, hard-working immigrant who was eager to please but still learning the ropes. I'll go out there this afternoon, Mohammed promised. feeling a pang of guilt. He knew he was neglecting the ranch, neglecting his responsibilities. But when he returned to the pen that evening, Ruin seemed different. She didn't retreat to the far corner. She stood near the center, watching him approach. He left the whip by the gate. He walked slowly, stopping a few feet away. He extended his hand, palm up, keeping his elbow bent, and relaxed. He didn't reach for her. He offered his hand to her. She stretched her neck out, her nostrils flaring, taking in his scent. She was trembling slightly, but she didn't step back. She lowered her head, sniffing his fingertips. Her breath was warm and smelled of sweet grass. Mohammed held his breath. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she rested her muzzle against his palm. It was a fleeting touch, lasting barely a second before she pulled back, but it felt like a lightning strike. Mohammed closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a sudden fierce rush of emotion. She had chosen to touch him. The progress over the next few weeks was painstakingly slow. A dance of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. He learned where she liked to be scratched, the base of her neck, and where she hated it, her flanks and ears. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her jaw, the slight widening of her eye that signaled she was reaching her breaking point. He introduced a soft cotton lead rope, draping it over her neck, letting her feel the weight of it without the constraint of a halter. She tolerated it, standing tense but still, while he murmured reassurances. Then, disaster struck. It was a hot, windless afternoon. Mohammed was working with Ruin in the pen, slowly attempting to slip a halter over her nose. She was nervous, tossing her head, but she wasn't panicking. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crack echoed across the valley. It sounded like a gunshot. Ruin didn't just spook, she shattered. She lunged forward, her chest colliding with Mohammed, knocking him hard into the dirt. He rolled, gasping for breath, just in time to see her crash violently into the heavy pipe fence. The metal groaned in protest. She scrambled up, frantic, and threw herself at the gate, tearing it off its hinges in a shower of splintering wood and screaming metal. She was gone, a roan blur disappearing into the dense sagebrush and timber that bordered the ranch. Mohammed lay in the dust, coughing, his ribs aching fiercely. "What happened?" Kelly yelled, helping him sit up. "Hunter," Mohammed rasped, clutching his side. "Up on the ridge. Someone fired a rifle." "She's gone, Mo," Simone said, staring at the shattered gate. "She's headed for the high country. We'll never catch her." They spent the rest of the day searching, riding the perimeter fences, and glassing the ridges with binoculars. There was no sign of her. That night, the atmosphere in the cookhouse was grim. "I told you," Razvan said quietly, breaking his usual silence. He sat by the fire, his cane resting against his knee. "Some horses can't be fixed. The fear is too deep." Mohammed didn't argue. He felt hollow, a profound sense of failure settling over him. He hadn't just lost a horse. He felt like he had betrayed her trust. The next morning, he rode out alone. He didn't take a rope or a halter. He just rode his steady gelding, Rusty, up into the timber where Ruin had vanished. He rode for hours, calling her name softly, feeling foolish but unable to stop. By mid-afternoon, he found her. She was standing in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pines. She was lathered in sweat, trembling violently, and limping heavily on her left hind leg. When she saw him, she didn't run. She just stood there, head low, the picture of utter defeat. Mohammed dismounted slowly, ground-tying Rusty. He approached her on foot, talking softly, holding his hands out. "It's okay, girl. I'm here. I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him, her eyes wide with terror. As he got closer, she whinnied a high, thin sound of distress. He stopped, sinking to his knees in the pine needles. He didn't try to touch her. He just sat there, making himself small, showing her he wasn't a threat. He sat there for an hour, the silence of the forest broken only by the wind in the trees and Ruin's ragged breathing. Finally, she took a step toward him, then another. She limped painfully, stopping a few feet away. She lowered her head, sniffing his shoulder, then his face. He didn't move. He let her investigate him, letting her reassure herself that he was the same man who had sat in the pen for weeks. Very slowly, she took one more step and rested her heavy head on his shoulder. Mohammed wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her mane. He felt her trembling subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh. They stayed like that for a long time. When he finally stood up, she didn't pull away. He took the lead rope from his saddle and clipped it to the remnants of the broken halter she still wore. She followed him back down the mountain, limping but calm, walking beside him with a quiet, desperate trust. They had found each other in the wilderness, and Mohammed knew, with absolute certainty, that the bond they had forged in that quiet clearing was stronger than any fear she carried. Getting Ruin back to the ranch was only half the battle. Her left hind leg, the one Lewis had warned about, was badly inflamed. She had clearly wrenched it during her panicked flight. When Lewis arrived the next morning, he didn't say, "I told you so," but his silence spoke volumes. He examined her cautiously in the round pen, while Mohammed held her head, murmuring reassurances. Ruin was tense, ears pinned, but she didn't strike out. She leaned heavily against Mohammed, seeking his protection. "It's a bad flare-up of the old injury," Lewis finally pronounced, stepping back. "Soft tissue damage, likely some arthritis in the hock joint. She needs strict stall rest and heavy anti-inflammatories." Mohammed winced. Stall rest was a death sentence for a horse like Ruin. Confining her in a small space would only exacerbate her anxiety. "I can't lock her up, Lewis. She'll tear the stall down. If she keeps moving on it, she'll tear the tendon." Lewis countered flatly. "It's your call, Mo. But you asked for my medical opinion." Mohammed compromised. He built a small, heavily padded medical paddock next to the barn, large enough for her to move around slightly, but small enough to restrict her activity. The next few weeks were grueling. Ruin hated the confinement. She paced constantly, agitating the injury. She stopped eating. The hollows above her eyes deepened, and the dull, lifeless look returned. The spark she had begun to show in the round pen was extinguishing. Kelly pulled him aside one evening, her face drawn. "We can't afford this, Mo. The vet bills are piling up. The feed bill is astronomical because she's wasting most of it, and she's miserable. Are you really doing her a favor?" It was the hardest question he had faced. He sat by Ruin's paddock late that night, watching her shift her weight restlessly, trying to ease the pain in her leg. He remembered a story his grandfather had told him about an old horse that had gone blind and found its way by listening to the footsteps of the others. Maybe Ruin didn't need physical freedom right now. Maybe she needed a different kind of purpose. The next morning he sought out Sophie. "You're good with your hands, Sophie. You carve, right?" Sophie nodded, surprised. "Yes, sir. Mostly just small things. I need you to build something specific." He described what he needed. A simple, lightweight contraption of leather straps and soft padding, designed to provide support to the hock joint, without restricting movement entirely. It was an unconventional idea, based on an old drawing he'd seen in a veterinary text from the 1920s. Sophie worked tirelessly for 3 days, cannibalizing old tack and soft fleece padding. When she finished, they took it to the paddock. Ruin was highly suspicious of the contraption. Mohammed spent an hour just letting her smell it, rubbing it against her shoulder before slowly, carefully buckling it around her injured leg. She stood frozen, unsure of the new pressure. Then cautiously she took a step. She hesitated, testing the support. The brace held. She took another step, then walked the perimeter of the paddock. The heavy limp was still there, but the sharp, wincing pain seemed lessened. "It works," Sophie whispered, her eyes shining. It wasn't a cure, but it was a management tool. It allowed Mohammed to start taking her on short, hand-led walks around the ranch. These walks became their ritual. Mohammed would lead her past the bustling activity of the main yard, exposing her to tractors, barking dogs, and shouting ranch hands. When she got nervous, he didn't pull on the rope or force her forward. He simply stopped, stood between her and the source of her fear, and waited until she lowered her head. He noticed something strange during these walks. Ruin wasn't just observing the ranch, she was analyzing it. She watched the cattle being moved with intense focus. She tracked the movement of the working dogs with her ears. One afternoon, they were walking past a holding pen where Carlos was struggling to sort a group of stubborn yearling steers. The steers were agitated, refusing to move through the gate, swirling in a chaotic mass. Carlos was frustrated, yelling and waving his arms, which only made things worse. Mohammed stopped Ruin a safe distance away, intending to wait until the commotion died down. But Ruin didn't want to wait. She planted her feet, her head high, watching the steers intently. She let out a sharp, authoritative snort. The steers froze. They turned their heads, looking at the scarred roan mare. Ruin took a step forward, pulling slightly on the lead rope. Mohammed hesitated, then loosened his grip. She didn't bolt. She walked purposefully toward the fence line. She didn't run at the steers or show aggression. She simply stood by the fence, her presence commanding and calm. She pinned her ears slightly and took one deliberate step toward the most agitated steer in the bunch. The steer backed down, turning away. The rest of the herd followed his lead, suddenly docile, and funneled through the gate exactly as Carlos had been trying to get them to do. Carlos stared at the mare, his mouth open. How did she do that? Mohammed chuckled softly, patting Ruin's neck. I don't know, but I think she just found her job. Ruin wasn't meant to be a riding horse. Her body was too broken, her mind too scarred for the demands of saddle work. But she understood herd dynamics in a way few humans ever could. She became the ranch's silent partner, a calming influence on agitated cattle, a steady presence that could quiet a frantic calf just by standing near it. She had found a way to be useful, not through speed or strength, but through presence. Autumn arrived with a vengeance, sweeping down from the Ruby Mountains in a flurry of icy wind and freezing rain. The ranch scrambled to prepare for winter, moving cattle down to the lower pastures and securing the hay barns. The tension on the broken circle was thicker than the storm clouds gathering overhead. The financial strain had become critical. The bank had sent a final notice. If Mohammed couldn't make the balloon payment by the end of the month, they would foreclose. We have to sell off the upper herd, Kelly stated flatly during a tense meeting in the kitchen. It's the only way to raise the cash quickly. Mohammed rubbed his face, exhausted. Selling the upper herd meant sacrificing years of careful breeding. It would cripple the ranch's future profitability. But they had no choice. Fine, he agreed quietly. We'll round them up tomorrow. The upper herd was grazing in a high, rugged canyon known as Devil's Punch Bowl. It was treacherous terrain, heavily timbered and steep, accessible only by narrow trails. The morning of the roundup dawned gray and bitter cold. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying the sting of sleet. Mohammed, Kelly, Simone, and Carlos rode out, wrapped in heavy slickers. Ruin stayed behind. Her braced leg couldn't handle the rough terrain, and Mohammed wouldn't risk her in the chaotic environment of a difficult roundup. She watched them leave from her paddock, her ears pricked, a low whinny following them up the trail. The roundup was a disaster from the start. The cattle were spooky, agitated by the dropping barometric pressure and the biting wind. The terrain made it impossible to move them smoothly. They splintered into small groups, crashing through the brush, refusing to head down the canyon. By mid-afternoon, the sleet had turned into heavy, wet snow. Visibility dropped to near zero. We need to call it off, Mo, Kelly yelled over the roaring wind, her horse fighting the bit. We're going to get someone killed out here. She was right. The trails were turning into ice chutes. They had only managed to gather about half the herd, pushing them into a makeshift holding pen near the top of the canyon. But the rest were scattered. Hold them here, Mohammed shouted back. I'm going to make one more sweep up the east ridge. I saw a group of heifers head that way. He spurred Rusty up the steep, slippery trail. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. The snow was falling so fast it was disorienting, erasing familiar landmarks. He found the heifers huddled under a stand of dense spruce, refusing to move. He tried to push them out, yelling and slapping his coiled rope against his chaps, but they just milled stubbornly in a circle. Suddenly, Rusty slipped. The gelding's front hooves hit a patch of solid ice hidden under the snow. He scrambled, trying to find purchase, but the slope was too steep. With a sickening groan, Rusty went down, rolling heavily onto his side. Mohammed felt a sharp, agonizing pop in his right knee as he was thrown clear. He hit the frozen ground hard. The breath knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, stars exploding behind his eyes, gasping for air. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled instantly. The pain was blinding, forcing him back to the ground. Rusty had scrambled to his feet, shaken but unharmed. He looked down at Mohammed, then nervously at the blowing snow, before turning and trotting back down the trail toward the holding pen. Mohammed was alone, miles from help, unable to walk. In a rapidly intensifying blizzard, he dragged himself under the meager shelter of a pine tree, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He knew the others would come looking for him, but in this weather, finding him on the vast, rugged ridge would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Hypothermia would set in long before they found him. Hours passed. The daylight faded into a murky, terrifying gray. The cold was no longer just painful. It was a heavy, lethargic weight pressing down on him. His thoughts grew sluggish, disjointed. He thought about Kelly, about the bank, about the ranch he was losing. Then, he heard it. It wasn't a shout or the barking of a dog. It was a sharp, high-pitched whinny, cutting through the howl of the wind. He forced his eyes open. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged. It was Ruin. She wasn't wearing a halter. She didn't have her brace on. She was limping heavily, her coat matted with snow and ice. But she was moving with determined, dogged persistence. She pushed her way through the deep snow, stopping right in front of him. She lowered her head, nuzzling his frozen cheek, her breath hot against his skin. "Ruin," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He didn't know how she had gotten out of her paddock, or how she had found him in the storm. It didn't matter. She was here. She nudged him harder, a clear demand. "Get up," he tried to explain, his words slurring. "I can't." Legs busted. Ruin didn't accept the excuse. She stepped closer, positioning herself parallel to him, her heavy shoulder brushing against his arm. She stood rock solid, a warm, living anchor in the freezing chaos. Mohammed understood. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he gritted his teeth, grabbed a handful of her icy mane, and hauled himself up. The pain in his knee was excruciating, threatening to drag him back down into unconsciousness. But Ruin didn't flinch. She took his weight, leaning into him, providing the support his broken leg couldn't. Together they began the agonizing descent. Mohammed leaned heavily on her shoulder, hopping on one leg, while Ruin navigated the treacherous, icy trail with agonizing slowness. She seemed to know exactly where to place her hooves, finding solid ground under the snow where Mohammed would have slipped. It took hours to navigate the ridge. Mohammed drifted in and out of consciousness, kept upright only by the steady, unyielding presence of the mare. He focused on the warmth radiating from her body, the rhythmic crunch of her hooves in the snow. When they finally stumbled into the clearing where the holding pen was located, Kelly and Simone were just mounting up, flashlights piercing the gloom, preparing to search for him. They saw the dark shape emerging from the timber and froze. "Mo!" Kelly yelled, her voice cracking with panic. She ran toward them, grabbing Mohammed as he finally let go of Ruin's mane and collapsed into the snow. "I've got you," Kelly sobbed, supporting his weight. "We've got you." Ruin stood back, exhausted, her head hanging low, her injured leg trembling violently. But she watched them, her ears pricked until Kelly helped Mohammed onto her horse and they began the slow ride back to the ranch. She had saved his life. And in doing so, she had proven that the broken mare nobody wanted had more heart, more loyalty than anyone could have ever imagined. The aftermath of the storm was a blur of pain, cast iron, and grim reality. Mohammed spent a week in the hospital, his shattered knee pinned and screwed back together. When he finally returned to the ranch, he was confined to a wheelchair, a heavy cast immobilizing his leg. The situation hadn't improved. The bank deadline had passed while he was in the hospital. The foreclosure proceedings were officially underway. Kelly broke the news to him as he sat on the porch, staring out at the snow-covered valley. "I tried to talk to them, Mo," she said, her voice heavy with defeat. "I explained what happened, about the storm and your leg. But they don't care. They want the money or they want the deed." Mohammed didn't say anything. He just watched Ruin, who was standing in her paddock, her head over the fence, watching him. Her limp was worse since the storm, the grueling trek taking a heavy toll on her already damaged joint. "We have to sell," Mohammed finally said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Everything. The herd, the equipment. Maybe we can raise enough to pay them off and keep the house." It was a devastating concession. It meant giving up the dream, admitting defeat. The news spread through the ranch like a plague. The hands went about their work in grim silence, knowing they were preparing the ranch for its own funeral. 2 days later, Odd Broberg drove into the yard. He parked his gleaming new truck next to Mohammed's battered one and walked up to the porch. "Heard about the leg, Mo," Odd said, pulling up a chair. "And I heard about the bank." Mohammed nodded curtly. He wasn't in the mood for Odd's lectures or his "I told you so's." "I also heard a crazy story from one of your hands," Odd continued, ignoring Mohammed's hostile silence. "Said that crippled roan mare of yours tracked you down in the blizzard and dragged you off the mountain." "She didn't drag me," Mohammed corrected quietly. "She walked me out." Odd leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I saw her at the auction, before you bought her. I knew the man who owned her before. Nasty piece of work. Used her for bronc riding practice, beat her when she wouldn't buck right, ruined her physically and mentally." Mohammed tightened his grip on the armrests of his wheelchair. "I thought you were a fool for buying her," Odd admitted. "Thought she was useless. But a horse that will walk into a blizzard to find a man who can't even ride her. That's not useless, Mo. That's something rare." Odd paused, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I'm looking to expand my operation," Odd said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I need good grazing land, and I need a place to winter my weanlings. Your lower pastures are perfect." He unfolded the paper and slid it across the small table between them. It was a check. The amount written on it was staggering, more than enough to pay off the bank, cover the vet bills, and keep the ranch running for a year. Mohammed stared at it, stunned. "Odd. I can't sell you the land. It's the heart of the ranch. I don't want to buy the land, son," Odd said with a rare, genuine smile. "I want to lease it. A 5-year lease. Paid up front. On one condition." Mohammed looked up, suspicious. "What condition?" "You manage the weanlings," Odd said. "You and your crew, but more importantly, you let that mare help." "Ruin?" Mohammed asked, bewildered. "I've seen what she does with your cattle," Odd said. "She's got a presence. Weanlings are nervous, flighty little things. They need a steady influence. They need a babysitter. I want her in the pasture with them." Mohammed looked past Odd, toward the paddock. Ruin was standing quietly, the winter sun catching the silver hairs in her roan coat. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but she was magnificent in her resilience. "Her name isn't Ruin," Mohammed said softly, realizing it for the first time. The name didn't fit anymore. It described what had been done to her, not who she was. He wheeled himself down the ramp and across the snow-packed yard, stopping at the fence of her paddock. Ruin limped over, lowering her head to rest it gently on his shoulder. He reached up, stroking her neck, feeling the solid, living warmth of her. "Hope," he whispered, the word hanging in the cold air. "Her name is Hope." Ruin Hope let out a long, soft sigh, closing her eyes. The Broken Circle Ranch didn't fail. It changed. They didn't run massive herds of cattle anymore. They became a sanctuary, a place where broken things, be it nervous weanlings, struggling ranch hands, or battered souls, could find a quiet place to heal. And at the center of it all was a scarred roan mare who couldn't be ridden, who walked with a heavy limp, but who commanded a herd with nothing more than a look, proving that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones everyone else has thrown away. Muhammad and Hope's story is a powerful reminder that value isn't always defined by perfection or utility. Sometimes, the deepest strength lies in the most broken places, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. Have you ever championed something or someone that others had given up on? Share your stories in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, please hit the like button, share it with fellow animal lovers, and subscribe for more tales of resilience, unexpected bonds, and the quiet triumphs that change everything.